and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. We're going to be discussing the initial conclusions of the public inquiry into the spy cops outrage this evening. The inquiry, as I'm sure many viewers will know, has been examining the conduct of undercover police officers who spied on 1,000 political groups between 1968 to at least 2010. Unsurprisingly, most of the groups that were spied on were socialists, but animal rights groups and environmental groups were also being targeted. It seems that veganism was considered way too subversive for the British establishment. So I'm delighted to welcome Paul Heron onto the show this evening. Paul's a lawyer and a socialist activist, actually. He's the legal director and senior solicitor at the Public Interest Law Centre, and he's an executive committee member of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers. Paul represents 11 core participants at the Spy Cops inquiry, including the former Labour MP Dave Nellis, the Stop the War Coalition, and CND. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining us this evening. Hope you're okay.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, it's great to be on Resistance TV. Thank you.
Nice one, mate. Yeah, thanks. I wonder if we maybe start then, really, just if you could say a little bit about Sir John Mitting's report, because it only covers the period from 1968 to 1982, doesn't it? So a lot of sort of contemporary people, I suppose, who've been targeted by the state, will not. I mean, some of them will be, obviously, but many of them, of course, won't be covered by this initial report, will it?
That's absolutely right. I mean, the report itself, which was released, I think, last week, if I recall, covers only 1968 to 82, as you say. That's in effect what's called tranche one or part one, but there's many other parts to come going forward, and it takes it up with regards to the Special Demonstration Squad up to 2008. As you probably know, Chris, the Undercover Policing Inquiry, or the UCPI, was announced further to pressure placed on the then Home Secretary Theresa May, and she announced the Undercover Police Inquiry, in fact, in 2015, as a result of the pressure, particularly of the women who, unknown to them, had sexual relationships with undercover police officers who infiltrated many, as you say, socialist left-wing anarchist groups during the period, and also under the pressure from the family of Stephen Lawrence, and that was granted. Tranche one itself, it covers 68 to 82, and really concentrates on many of the groups that were in the forefront of activism during that time. So it began really to start to spy on the likes of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, but also began the process of looking at all kinds of groups, from the Troops Out movement to the Socialist Workers' Party and other groups like that. So that's in essence the first part of the Undercover Policing Inquiry, and the first part of I would guess ongoing reports over the next 2 to 3 years.
Right. Just say a little bit about the Special Demonstration Squad that you mentioned there, because I suspect a lot of viewers will not be familiar with that. What were they, and what did they do?
So the Special Demonstration Squad, or the SDS, was formed mainly after the first Vietnam Solidarity Campaign demonstration. For people who are too young maybe to even know what that was, it was a broad-based campaigning body which campaigned against the Vietnam War in the 60s and the 70s, and also Britain's involvement in the Vietnam War itself. And the SDS was particularly concerned and was set up as a result of the first demonstration, which resulted in some public order, but obviously it was overplayed, I would say, during that period. And at that time, and significantly, and maybe we can explore this later, the SDS sent individual officers, they grew the hair a little bit, grew a bit of a beard, and sat at the back of Vietnam Solidarity Campaign branch meetings and public meetings, and just made a few notes and fed it up to their commanding officers, so that in their eyes, or the arguments of the Metropolitan Police Service, to make sure that they were ready for the next demonstration in '68. And obviously those techniques and that development of spying obviously developed over the next 2, 3, 4 years into something far more sophisticated, far more invasive as the years went by. And it's interesting, Chris, that one of the officers who was questioned during the course of the inquiry actually said, I thought after the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign was wound up in 1971-72, that actually the Special Demonstration Squad would be closed down. And of course, it wasn't. It wasn't just closed down. The MPS, at the behest of other organisations, which we might want to go into, doubled down on their techniques and developed their techniques of infiltration. So the police officers were not just in the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign for 6 to 12 months. They actually then went deep undercover and were often involved in campaigning organisations for 4 to 5 years.
Do you find it surprising that this squad was established under a Labour government, and it was actually a Tory government that ended up agreeing to mount this inquiry? I mean, counterintuitive, isn't it?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think historically, certain leading figures in the Labour governments gone by, and certainly in the Labour parties gone by, have often been, almost against the Labour movement at the back.
Yeah, that's true.
Campaigning instincts of the Labour movement and the campaigning movement, and seem to be even more terrified of campaigners, socialists, trade unionists, and campaigners generally than even some Tory governments. Although obviously we wouldn't want to go too far on that, because Tory governments have equally been terrified of it. What is surprising is the fact that Labour governments to Tory governments to Labour governments to Tory governments doubled down on this technique. And let's be clear about this, they were governments, cabinets, senior civil servants, and the security services were all customers of the Special Demonstration Squad over the course of of Tranche 1, which, as we say, is 68 to 1982.
Why is it taking so long to reach a conclusion? And we've only got to 1982. It's taken them years to get there, and I don't know how many other years we're going to have to wait to, get the next report.
I think there's a number of reasons for that, and sadly, I'd have to say that the bulk of them, in my opinion, the Metropolitan Police Service have used every tactic under the sun to delay the progress of the undercover policing inquiry. They've insisted on numerous restriction orders. They've insisted on redactions to documents. They have ensured that many of the police officers themselves have not given live evidence. They've insisted that many of the officers do not even give their cover name, let alone their own name. And yet at the same time as they are, refusing to give their name and their cover name, they've used their own human rights to defend the idea that they should have, privacy, whilst at the same time, they were happy to, be all over the privacy of many of the activists they spied on throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. And it's kind of laughable in the sense that they have done that. And unfortunately, I'd have to say that, the inquiry itself has probably not been hard enough on ensuring that certain things are done quicker and better. When you contrast the way the undercover policing inquiry have acted with the COVID inquiry have faced down a judicial review from the Cabinet Office to ensure that the WhatsApp messages of Boris Johnson are
Yes, indeed.
disclosed to the COVID inquiry. I don't feel that sometimes the undercover policing inquiry have acted in the same kind of way that a public inquiry should do. And so that's kind of the delays that come forward. But having said that, the disclosure that we have seen, which many people who watch this or listen to this can go and see to the undercover policing inquiry website, you go and search some of that, has been extremely revealing as to how the tactics have changed of the Special Demonstration Squad, and also has been revealing over who the customers of the Special Demonstration Squad have been and have changed over the years as well.
What justification have they given for the redactions, Paul?
Well, the justifications have mainly been privacy.
Right.
So in terms of, many people will go onto the undercover policing inquiry website and they will look at some of the documentation that's there, or they can go to Declassified UK, where I've written a number of articles which directs people to certain documentation. And you'll see that some of the issues have been redacted for genuine privacy reasons, because obviously certain people might not want their names to be out there at certain times. The other reasons are because the police have, certainly some of the redactions that have happened is because the police themselves have insisted that certain redactions take place. And the only defence I could probably give the UCPI, the Undercover Policing Inquiry, is of course they've had to play a fine line between the demands of the police and the demands of core participants and those who've been spied on. But I must admit, in my feeling, and certainly my client's feeling, is that sometimes the inquiry have been too willing to side with the police at different times when it comes to redactions than actually siding with core participants and those who have been spied on during the course of the undercover policing inquiry. Having said that, as I said before, Chris, one of the things that has been revealing about the disclosure we have had is, if we go back to 1968, the undercover officers were at the back of a meeting taking a few notes and reporting about potential public order or potential subversive activities of left-wing campaigning groups. But what we see change is who the customers are. Initially, the customers were leading police, the MPS, if you like, the Metropolitan Police Service. But later on, the customers were definitely the security services. The security services, MI5 in particular, play a role in directing where SDS, Special Demonstration Squad officers should go and the kind of information that they're looking for. And so whilst in the first tranche, the Metropolitan Police Service lawyers have been saying, well, we needed to do this spying because of public order or subversives, or subversively, to check on subversion and subversives. That has largely been dismissed in this first report by Mitting and by the Undercover Policing Inquiry. And so it begs the question, well, if the public order issue is dismissed, if the reasons to check on subversives has been dismissed, what are the reasons for the Special Demonstration Squad to continue? Because let's be clear about it, it continued from 1982 right up to 2008. And I think for my clients in particular, that's a question that they would really like answered. Because if it wasn't for public order reasons, it's not for allegations of being subversives, which of course there's a whole debate over that separately. Then if it's not for those reasons, then indeed what was the reason for the SDS to continue?
Well, Thatcher coined the term "the enemy within" during the miners' strike, and I suspect it was that mentality that drove the decision to spy on socialist groups. And what is, particularly egregious, in my opinion anyway, as a former Labour Party member of 44 years standing, no longer a party member, it's really gone down the tubes, is that, as we were saying earlier, it was actually this process started by a Labour government and continued by a Labour government. But I don't wonder, when will part 2 be published then, do you think, Paul? Which is, I think, the one which will be of most contemporaneous interest to people, won't it? Because, most of the victims who, are involved in that period, they will still be alive, and many of the people in the earlier part sadly will have passed away.
Yeah, so Tranche 2, or Part 2, Tranche 2, covers 1983 to around about 1992, 1993. So about a 10-year period. So
it doesn't even go all the way up to 2010 then?
No, that comes later on in Tranche 3 and Tranche 4. So Tranche 2 will probably, as most people will identify, will look at the peace movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, maybe one of the areas that the Tranche 2 will cover. It will certainly, and I'm sure, will cover the miners' strike. It may also cover issues like Wapping.
Yes, indeed.
It may also even go so far as to cover the poll tax movement, the movement against the poll tax itself. Yes, and it may even look at Labour councils who in the 1980s were having their own battles with central government. And I'm thinking in particular Lambeth Council and possibly Liverpool Council
and
as
Liverpool,
well.
yes, indeed. So, and there were others as well. But
and there are those are the kind of issues that it could cover. As we understand it, we will clients who are core participants in the Tranche 2 will probably look to be getting disclosure from the inquiry later this year, with the inquiry then sitting for several weeks in the summer of next year, 2024, to examine not just the documentation, but obviously to cross-examine core participants, meaning activists who were spied on, and also officers who did the spying, if you like. And I would guess that I'm guessing, although we've got no indication at this point, a further interim report may come out at the end of that part, or it may go then straight into Tranche 3 in the next year, and maybe there'll be an interim report combining 2 and 3. We've got no indication as to whether there'll be an interim report. But as you said, Chris, there are going to be significant movements and organisations that will be looked at during that period, and some of the issues that, some of the campaigns and issues I suspect will be looked at by the inquiry itself.
So in terms of timescales then, Tranche 2's goal will be when, do you think? And Tranche 3 and 4, when can we expect them?
So I think what we're looking at, and what we've been advised by the undercover policing inquiry, is the whole of the inquiry should finish in 2026. So there will be a bit of a gallop on now that we've started.
So that's Tranche 4 will include.
So there are 3 modules. Module 1 is split into 5 or 6 tranches. So those 6 tranches in Module 1 will probably finish by 2026, and then Module 2 and 3 will probably finish fairly quickly after that. But it's this first module which is going to take the longest amount of time, and we've been promised that 2026. It may run over into 27, but certainly it will get a gallop on over the next 2 or 3 years.
Right. Okay. Then that's interesting. And of course you're saying, as I understand it anyway, it's going to go up to at least 2010. But is it likely to go beyond that? I suspect the spying hasn't stopped. I wouldn't have thought. I don't know what you think about that. But I mean, what about the period beyond 2010?
So the terms of reference have asked the inquiry to look at undercover policing, and largely we would say the undercover policing they're looking at is what my clients would certainly deem undercover political policing. Yes. So, I mean, there may be even an argument for undercover policing if it's serious crime, etc.
Yeah,
but undercover political policing is mainly focusing on 2 squads. The first squad is the Special Demonstration Squad, and then the second squad is what's called the NPOIU, which is the National Public Order and Intelligence Unit, which ran for a few years after the Special Demonstration Squad. And that had particular interest, as you said in your opening, in the animal rights movement and the environmental movement. So that's particularly what it was looking at. The SDS is looking at particularly, not exclusively, but left-wing movements, trade unions, issues around blacklisting, the peace movement, etc.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned animal rights partly because declaring interest. I mean, I've been an animal rights campaigner myself from the mid-1970s and a vegan since 1976. So it was interesting to see how veganism was seen as a kind of subversive dietary decision moral dietary decision by people. But I mean, just on it might sound an obvious and stupid question in some ways, but I guess some people might say, why should we be concerned about these undercover operations?
I mean, I think the first thing is, I think for historical reasons, I think it's important for particularly the socialist labour movement, but all campaigners to be aware and to understand, if you like, what has gone on, and to understand the role that the police played during this period. So I'll give you one example, and I pinpointed this at the start. In '68, we suspect, and our clients have argued, and we've certainly put submissions to the inquiry, that certainly by the early 1970s, the role of the SDS officers, the Special Demonstration Squad, undercover officers, their role changed. And their role changed, we suspect, at the behest of the security services and also government. And that role changed from officers sitting at the back of meetings taking notes to actually officers starting to take positions, and in some cases leading positions in organisations. So I'll give you an example. In what a client that I represent, Richard Chesham, was an activist in the Troops Out movement, and he set up a branch at the behest of an undercover officer called Rick Gibson. His real name was Richard Clark. And Richard Clark, through his activities in setting up a branch in South East London, rose through the organisation to at one point actually becoming, for a period of about 6 to 9 months, the leader of the Troops Out movement. So you had, at one point, the Troops Out movement being led by an undercover officer, being the leader of the Troops Out movement. And this is not unusual. And the reason why it's important is because the officers who took positions, often as treasurers or paper organisers in the case of SWP branches, started to sift information through to their security services and through to government. In the cases of the SWP, 2 officers took leading positions in the Right to Work campaign, which was organised by the Socialist Workers' Party in the late 1970s, 1980s. But they were in the national headquarters, and they were taking photocopies of trade union branches who supported the Right to Work campaign. Now, the reason that's important is so that we understand that when the powers that be in this country talk about us being in a democracy and we have this grand democracy, that actually we had something akin to a Stasi-light organisation that was prepared to open special branch files on tens, if not hundreds of thousands of activists, some very committed activists, some very just people getting involved. And it's important that we understand that, this is the role that the police played in derailing movements, but also the amount of information that was hoovered up by the Special Demonstration Squad at the behest of government, at the behest of the security services. And we want to know, what was the reason for this? What was the reason when, in the first stage of this inquiry, The inquiry has concluded there was no public order legitimate reason, and there was no subversive legitimate reason. And so serious questions need to be asked. And that's why this inquiry is so important in my book, in my
Paul, is there any evidence that the undercover police officers who, got into positions of influence acted as agents provocateurs, or were they mainly, monitoring and just, as it were, hoovering on that information and feeding it back?
Well, at this stage, in terms of the disclosure, it's generally quite hard to see that. However, reports by activists that have come out, particularly in the Guardian newspaper, so the likes of Rob Evans, who's been a pioneer of covering this work and the role of the undercover officers. Yeah, certain activists have made, particularly later on in the 2000s, if you like, made accusations that officers did act as agents provocateurs. So whilst at this point from memory, there's no disclosure showing that, admittedly, we don't know whether we've had every piece of disclosure, but certainly in the later years of the SDS, the reports have been, published in The Guardian, for instance, where activists do say that officers did act in fact, in a role as an agent provocateur. Serious accusations have been made against officers to try and get activists to take part in extremely, extreme criminal violence, which, obviously the inquiry will need to look into at a later date. Yeah. Sure.
What do you think these revelations say about the state of our democracy then? You started to touch on that, Paul, but I mean, just in general, what do you think about
what I think has shocked me is, you introduced me as a socialist, and I certainly am, and I've been involved in trade unions and the labour movement for some time. There's always been, as you and I both know, and I'm sure people who are watching, there's always been accusations of monitoring, whether it's been the Economic League or the work that the Blacklist Support Group have done around the Consulting Association. And there's always been those accusations. And it's certainly been the case that that's always been a discussion around the labour movement. I think what the disclosure which we've been provided with so far, and many people, if you go, as I say, and encourage people to go onto the inquiry website to just have a look at it, what's actually shocked me is the extent of the monitoring, that people who have been involved in anti-racist campaigns, involved in campaigns against the restrictions on abortion, campaigns in police monitoring or whatever, that they've all had special branch files opened on them. And the extent of that is quite revealing. I would say, we came across a document, which again I've covered in one of the declassified and the articles I did for Declassified UK, that upwards of 900,000 people had slips which were then put into a special branch. If 3 or 4 slips are then put in, so Chris Williamson appears 3 or 4 times, 5 times on a slip provided by police through to special branch, a file is likely to have been opened on you. And we suspect there are hundreds of thousands of files been opened in special branch, and people can go in. And these files, by the way, are opened on hundreds of individuals and hundreds of organizations. In your opening, you said hundreds of organizations were spied on. In fact, 1,000 groups have been spied on by the Metropolitan Police between 1968 and 2008. So it's quite, the extent has actually shocked me that how much is actually gone on.
Yeah. Is the deep state out of control then, Paul?
Well, on this evidence so far, it's hard to say that there's not a problem, and there's not a serious problem. I mean, I think the interconnection between the Special Demonstration Squad, MI5, Cabinet, and indeed the Economic League and later the Consulting Association, the interchange of information that has gone on is quite staggering. And I think, serious questions need to be asked going forward.
Who's going to ask those questions, though? Because the political class seem to have been taken prisoner, don't they? I mean, I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, the political class, sadly, have to a large extent, from my own personal perspective, it feels like they're bought and paid for by big business and capital, and there is a serious problem. Sorry.
No, I was going to say. I was just going to say. I was on a podcast the other day with George Galloway, and we were talking about, what's happened to the political class, and we were talking about actually my intervention when I was still an MP and asking difficult questions about the integrity initiative as one example, and he cited people like Tam Dial and Tony Benn obviously and others who were tenacious and relentless and asking these awkward and difficult questions. The point I was putting to George was that the political class seemed to be, useless really. You've got the kind of, the deep state sort of out of control, and there's no check or balance, it seems to me. And I mean, and George's view was that, people like Tam Dial and myself, me to a lesser extent, and others, Dave Nellis, obviously, they feel like the awkward squad, for want of a better phrase. That's the kind of pejoratively the way in which they've often been, people like those have been described. Asking these difficult questions did actually, to some extent, restrict the more egregious excesses, perhaps. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but like you say, it seems to me anyway that at the moment, anyway, the political class, across the spectrum in the House of Commons, as you say, bought and paid for. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Paul.
I mean, from a personal perspective, I joined the Labour Party when I was 15, and I remember going to a ward meeting, and this was in Wallasey, so in Merseyside, where I'm from. Now, at that time, Wallasey was a Conservative held seat. It hasn't been for a long time.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that at that ward meeting, this is just a ward meeting, I could probably say there was probably in the region of 30 odd people at that ward meeting. Bearing in mind that it wasn't a Labour seat. I remember the ward meetings that I went to, and later when I got involved in the Young Socialists, but certainly the ward meetings I went to, there was a cut and thrust of debate that was tolerated. Yeah. There was a right wing in the Labour Party, which, to be honest with you, would probably be considered the left wing now of the Labour Party.
Well, that's probably true, yeah.
And there was very much a Labour left wing, often trade unionists and factory workers. But what was interesting is that ward meeting also had a reflection of working class people in there. And that was in a Conservative held seat. And that's the difference, is that I think that the Labour Party, for some time, has lost its way because it's abandoned the people who founded it and vote for it and campaign for it and door knock for it and all the rest of it. And I think, in my personal point of view, Corbyn, the rise of Jeremy Corbyn was an aberration in some ways and actually saved the Labour Party temporarily. And I worry for the Labour Party's existence going forward, because I don't think it represents the interests of working class people, even in a tiny way, because those MPs who get elected are no longer, and certainly for some time, are no longer accountable to their constituencies.
Yeah. My only worry about the existence of the Labour Party is that it does continue to exist, and my sort of ambition now is to do everything I can to destroy the Labour Party, because in my opinion it's a bigger barrier to socialism than the Tories are, because they're a bunch of frauds and they kind of give the illusion of democracy, while in reality sustaining the status quo. But just going back to, and you might want to comment on that as well, but just going back to the spy cop stuff, Paul. I mean, why do you think the corporate media hasn't given it more attention? I know there's been articles in the Guardian, and there's been some coverage, but I mean, this to me seems to be like a really terrible scandal, and yet there's not been that much, I don't think. I mean, I said, and funnily enough, I was talking to my daughter-in-law today, and I said, I'm doing this podcast, with yourself about the spy cop revelations, and she didn't know about the spy cop revelations. So a lot of us who were in that kind of political bubble, I mean, obviously to us, this, we're absolutely across this, and we're aware of it. But to the wider general public, they're not, and that's big, in my opinion, a real massive failure of the corporate media. But I mean, do you take the same view? Do you think there has been sufficient coverage, or am I being unfair or not?
I think it's been sporadic, but overall it's been largely disappointing. I mean, as I said before, the likes of Rob Evans has done a tenacious job covering it in the Guardian, and there has been sporadic articles here and there, but that tends to be as a result of pressure from, I would hats off to particularly the women who pioneered, who were deceived into sexual relationships with many of these undercover officers. They have done an amazing job at keeping it to the forefront. So, it's recently been covered in the Daily Mail. But really, in terms of the scandal which has unfolded even under Tranche 1, the scandal that has been unfolded, it has been largely disappointing. And it really, what's been, the print media have done bits and bobs, even the Telegraph and the Times and bits and bobs. It's been quite sporadic, but there's been very little serious journalism from the TV, the main TV stations, BBC, ITV and Sky, etc. There's been very little beyond, the very broad brush, if at all. And to be honest with you, it has been extremely disappointing. But the thing is, the core participants I represent, and certainly all the core participants I've spoken to, I think they're in for the long haul. We want to shake the tree. We want to ensure that any information that comes out is spread far and wide, and in as many ways that we can do it, whether it's, through, your own TV channel, your own podcast, through, web newspapers like The Canary and Declassified to broad as possible, and to try and get a clear as message as possible to the scale of what's happened in the name of, quotes, democracy. Because, in years gone by, quite rightly, fingers have been pointed at, authoritarian regimes all over the world for the kind of surveillance that there's been. But I really do think that the surveillance that's taken place, that's been uncovered, even in Tranche 1 so far, is of, epic proportions, really. And it's a shame that there hasn't been more coverage. But, we just got to keep on plugging away.
Keep on keeping on. What do you think? Why do you think that is? I mean, just because corporate media's in the pockets of the, the elites?
I think there's an element of that. I think there's also, the problem with news media today, it lives on sound bites and simple forms. And I think, unfortunately, some of the detail that's involved in this and how we've had to piece together the various disclosure documents to piece together a picture of what's going on, it requires a journalism which, unfortunately, not many mainstream media outlets are prepared to really persevere with. And of course, that's because, there's the soundbite elements, but there's also that lots of media organisations, are bought and paid for by 2 or 3 wealthy.
True enough. But the state broadcaster, Paul, gave an hour to the anti-Semitism scam in the Labour Party on Panorama. They gave an hour to it, and it was a total scam. And yet, this, which is a genuine scandal against ordinary people, victims of the state. I mean, women, like you say, being impregnated by undercover officers. I mean, no, to be fair, the media has covered that, but my goodness me, there is so much more they could be reporting, and yet they're sort of absent from the scene, it seems to me.
I mean the reality is we've got Panorama, but I think there's other programs which back in the day probably would have covered it. So
The
World in Actions of this.
Yes, of course,
would have done it, and other Pilger would have been probably on this, and
absolutely,
absolutely. As well. So I think there has been a failure by mainstream media, but there again, I think mainstream media has been hollowed out of journalists who probably would have covered this back in the day. It's been hollowed out so that there's not the same kind of interest, because of course the many of the journalists come from backgrounds where actually this requires too much work, and they'd sooner report on whether there's a right or wrong about George Osborne being covered in orange confetti. Conversations about that, whether that's right or wrong, when the reality is it would take time and effort to really dig down and do some decent reporting on what's gone on so far. And there's so many reasons for that, and you've pointed some of them out, and certainly the lack of quality journalism is unfortunately is a disease at the moment.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and some of the quality journalism that we did get on things like Afshin Ratanzi's Going Underground, which was on RT and so on, of course, has now been banned. I mean, it's you couldn't make it up really in a so-called democracy that dissenting voices, it seems, will not be tolerated. But just finally, Paul, what would you say, or what would you advise be to people? I mean, how can ordinary people fight against this abuse? What can they do, this abuse of state power?
I mean, I think the first thing is, the most important thing is people shouldn't be afraid to organise. People shouldn't be afraid to campaign, because despite all this monitoring and despite all this, name checking and all the rest of it, the National Front were defeated in the 1970s.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
The miners organised tenaciously throughout the 80s and nearly came to the brink of defeating the Thatcher government. The poll tax was organised and defeated as well, and different campaigns have been successful on a local level. Tens of thousands of campaigns have been successful on a local level, and so campaigning has achieved great things, and people shouldn't be afraid to campaign. So that's the message, which, notwithstanding all this kind of surveillance, they haven't been able to defeat movements of people in mass numbers, or even in local communities campaigning against even small things. So I think that's the main message that has to come across, is do not be afraid of campaigning, even though this is going on. And I think in terms of, the point that has to be made as well is, going back to the mainstream media, young people in particular do not look to the mainstream media now for their information.
No, true.
They go to Al Jazeera, for instance. They will go to websites such as The Canary, The Intercept, or Declassified, your own TV station, Socialist TV, etc., etc. And I think their failure to report on this kind of thing really ultimately doesn't matter, because through Resistance TV and through other forms of communication, young people, working class people, are more sophisticated now in looking for what they want, and more fool the mainstream media for not covering it.
No, absolutely. Well, listen, Paul, thanks very much indeed for taking the time out to speak to us this evening. It's been incredibly interesting, if depressing, but also, I think, uplifting as well, with your final rallying cry at the end of your contribution this evening. So thank you so much for doing that. Finally, how can people follow your work, Paul? Are you on social media, or I mean, how can people follow your work?
So the Public Interest Law Centre is on social media which is on Twitter at Public Law Centre. So at Public Law Centre. We also have a website, which is www.pilc.org.uk. And of course, look at Declassified, look at Resistance TV, look at Spies Out of Lies. I would also make a big plug for the women who campaign under the moniker of Spies Out of Lives. They've got a website, and the other, I would certainly recommend that they also look at that, because they do some amazing work, campaigning work around the inquiry as well.
Brilliant. Nice. Well, thanks again, Paul, and thank everybody for watching this evening. All being well, we'll be back next week at the same time, 7 o'clock on Wednesday on Resistance TV. So until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.